On a foggy morning in January 1944, deep in the English countryside at Camp Forest, Tennessee, something extraordinary was about to be born. A classified unit of just over 1,000 American soldiers was assembling under the cover of absolute secrecy. These weren't your typical infantrymen or tank crews. These were artists, sound engineers, radio operators, and designers who would soon wield brushes and inflatable rubber instead of rifles and grenades. They called themselves the Ghost Army, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. And they were about to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't what kills, but what deceives. The idea seemed almost absurd. In the middle of humanity's most devastating conflict, while millions of young men were dying in trenches and on beaches across Europe and the Pacific, the United States military was training a unit whose primary weapons were fake rubber tanks, cardboard airplanes, and elaborate theatrical performances. But what these men were preparing to do would save thousands of American lives and help win the greatest war in human history. They were going to lie so convincingly that they would fool Adolf Hitler himself. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, a former magazine editor turned military strategist, had conceived this audacious plan. He understood something that many generals at the time did not, that in modern warfare, information was becoming as crucial as ammunition. The enemy's decisions were based on what they believed to be true, and if you could control what they believed, you could control their actions. Ingersoll's vision was simple, yet revolutionary. Create a mobile unit capable of impersonating entire divisions, complete with false radio chatter, fake equipment, and theatrical sound effects that would make a small group of men appear to be a massive army. The men recruited for this mission came from the most unlikely corners of American society. Art students from prestigious schools found themselves alongside Broadway set designers. Sound engineers from Hollywood studios worked next to farmers' sons who had never seen a movie. What united them wasn't their background, but their imagination and their willingness to embrace a form of warfare that had never been attempted on such a scale. They were told they would be playing dress-up with death itself as the stakes. The equipment they trained with seemed like something from a circus rather than a battlefield. Massive rubber tanks that could be inflated in minutes, complete with realistic details down to the mudguards and serial numbers. These weren't crude imitations. They were masterpieces of deception, crafted with the same attention to detail that Hollywood used for its most expensive productions. When fully inflated, a Sherman tank replica weighed only a fraction of the real thing, but looked absolutely authentic from the air or at a distance. Two men could carry what appeared to be a 30-ton monster, but the visual deception was only part of the illusion. The Ghost Army's sound engineers had recorded actual tank movements, artillery placements, and troop formations on specialized equipment. They could project the sounds of an entire armored division moving through the night from speakers hidden in the woods. German reconnaissance flights would hear what sounded like hundreds of vehicles preparing for battle, when in reality it might be just a handful of Americans operating phonographs and amplifiers. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element of all. The Ghost Army's operators didn't just send fake messages. They created entire fictional command structures, complete with realistic traffic patterns, communication protocols, and even personal quirks of imaginary officers. They studied captured German intelligence reports to understand exactly what the enemy was listening for, then gave them precisely what they expected to hear. But in all the wrong places, as D-Day approached, the Ghost Army was deployed to southeastern England as part of Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Their mission was to create the impression that General George Patton's fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group was massing for an assault across the narrowest part of the English Channel. Every inflatable tank, every fake radio transmission, every carefully staged maneuver was designed to reinforce this lie. The psychological pressure on these men was immense. They knew that if their deception failed, Thousands of their fellow Americans would die on the beaches of France. Unlike frontline soldiers who could see their enemy and measure their success in ground gained or positions held, the Ghost Army fought in shadows and uncertainty. They might spend weeks perfecting an illusion, never knowing if a single German reconnaissance photograph or intercepted radio message had exposed their charade. The attention to detail was staggering. They painted authentic-looking wear patterns on their fake tanks, positioned them to cast realistic shadows, and even created tire tracks in the mud that matched the weight and movement patterns of real armor. When German agents observed their camps, they saw exactly what they expected to see: a massive military buildup preparing for invasion. The deception was so complete that even Allied personnel not cleared for the operation were often fooled by what they witnessed. On June 6, 1944, as the first waves of American troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Ghost Army's deception was working perfectly. German forces remained concentrated at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler's commanders remained convinced that the real assault was yet to arrive, exactly where the Ghost Army had told them it would. The rubber tanks and painted canvas had bought precious time and saved countless lives, but their war was far from over. Following the successful D-Day landings, the Ghost Army moved to France, where they continued their deadly game of deception. Near the town of Brest, they impersonated the 6th Armored Division, allowing the real unit to move into position undetected. In the Rhineland, they created phantom crossings of the Rhine River, drawing German defenders away from actual Allied operations. Each mission was a carefully choreographed performance where the slightest mistake could mean exposure and death. The human cost of maintaining these elaborate deceptions was severe, though different from that faced by conventional units. These men lived with the constant knowledge that their survival depended on their ability to lie convincingly to professional soldiers trained to detect deception. They slept in camps that existed only to be observed by enemy agents. They maintained radio schedules for fictional units while real battles raged around them. The psychological strain of living a lie for months at a time, never knowing if their performance was believable enough, broke some men completely. Yet they persevered, driven by the knowledge that their peculiar form of warfare was saving American lives. Every German tank that remained in the wrong position because of their deception, every enemy regiment that prepared for an attack that would never come, meant fewer Americans would die in actual combat. They were fighting a war where success was measured not in enemy casualties, but in the successful manipulation of enemy expectations. The individual stories within the Ghost Army revealed the human dimension of this extraordinary deception. Private Arthur Shilstone, a professional illustrator before the war, spent months perfecting the art of making new equipment look battle-worn and authentic. Sergeant Victor Dowd, a former radio engineer, became so skilled at mimicking German radio procedures that he could predict enemy responses to his fictional transmissions. These men brought professional expertise from civilian careers that had never been considered militarily relevant, proving that victory sometimes required skills that no military academy could teach. The Ghost Army's final major operation came in March 1945, as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine River in force. Their mission was to convince German commanders that the main assault would come at a heavily fortified section of the river, while the actual crossing occurred miles away at a more vulnerable point. For 2 weeks, they maintained an elaborate deception involving hundreds of fake vehicles, constant radio chatter, and sound effects that suggested massive preparations for an amphibious assault. German artillery and reserves concentrated exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them, leaving the real crossing point lightly defended. When the war ended in May 1945, the Ghost Army had participated in over 20 major deception operations across Europe. Their contributions to victory were impossible to quantify precisely, but military historians estimate that their operations may have shortened the war by months and saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. Yet for decades after the war, their story remained classified. The men who had fought this shadow war returned to civilian life, carrying secrets they couldn't share. Their extraordinary service unknown to the families and communities that welcomed them home. The silence surrounding the Ghost Army continued well into the Cold War, as military leaders recognized that the techniques pioneered by these American artist soldiers might be needed again. The methods they developed for battlefield deception, electronic warfare, and psychological operations became foundation elements of modern military doctrine. Their innovations in camouflage, communication intercept, and disinformation would influence military thinking for generations. When the Ghost Army's story finally began to emerge in the 1980s and 1990s, it revealed a profound truth about American character and ingenuity. Faced with an existential threat, the United States had responded not just with industrial might and conventional military power, but with creativity, imagination, and a willingness to embrace unconventional solutions. The Ghost Army represented something uniquely American, the belief that any problem, no matter how daunting, could be solved if you were willing to think differently about it. Today, only 7 members of the Ghost Army remain alive, all over 90 years old. In 2024, Congress finally awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, recognizing their unique contribution to victory in World War II. Their legacy lives on not just in military doctrine, but in the reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior firepower, but from superior imagination. The young Americans who turned rubber and paint into instruments of victory proved that in the most serious of endeavors, creativity and deception could be the most powerful weapons of all.